Welcome, everybody. Welcome back. Happy Easter. We are in day
Thank you.
3 of the Easter season here, as we begin these 50 days of joy and celebration, heading off toward Pentecost, which might be my favorite or second favorite liturgical feast day. But it is so good to be back with you all. I hope you had wonderfully, blessed and enlivening Holy Weeks and good celebrations of everything that we as church gathered to celebrate last week. It's good to be back with you all. Today we're going to be taking on, as you know, chapter 5 of Laudato Si, Lines of Approach and Action, and which really is about economics and business and politics. And the first of 2 chapters, there's 2 chapters here. We're entering into the final stretch here with Pope Francis. The first of 2 chapters that really make the turn from theory to practice, or from theology to practice, or from whatever it is. Chapters 1 through 4 are really there to lay out the problematic, talk in chapter 2 about the Christian tradition's particular take on this, in chapter 3 to talk about those underlying problems, the technocratic paradigm, anthropocentrism that have led to the crisis, and then chapter 4 theorizing, hypothesizing the solution in the form of integral ecology. And so when we get here to chapter 5, it's sort of, we're turning a corner toward, well, okay, all this sounds great, Francis. How do we do this? What is it that we need to be doing socially, collectively, and on all different levels? And so in chapter 5, we're going to get that in the context of politics and economics and social systems and that kind of thing. And then in chapter 6, next week, we're going to be looking at spirituality and prayer and liturgy and practice and in sort of more churchy applications. So those are the kind of 2 chapters that we have left. And then finally, as you all know, in that week 7, in that final week that we have, we are going to collectively brainstorm and workshop, all of us here, the people out in webinar land and here in Zoom land, programs and initiatives that we might be able to create in our local communities, whatever those communities are, in order to turn this vision more and more into practice. So it's my hope that by the time, 2 weeks from tonight, when we get to that last session, that we will all walk away with at least one sort of concrete idea for something that we could go back to a parish or a school or a university or a religious community or, a neighborhood or whatever it is, and say, hey, I just finished this 7-week class on this Laudato Si encyclical, and I know we all come from different backgrounds maybe, but I think we need to be working on this together. And I hope that we can all walk away with something concrete and actionable that we can use to turn this vision into practice. So that's just a quick sort of, just over midway check-in, where we've been, where we're going, and how all this is going to connect together. And I just want to say thank you, because it's been great working with all of you over these last 4 or 5 weeks as we've been venturing and journeying through this encyclical together. So with that in mind, I wanted to start tonight's session a little bit differently, and this might go somewhere and it might not go somewhere, but we'll see where it goes. Because, as I said, we're kind of at the crossroads, turning from theory to practice, from the ideas to sort of applications. And since we've covered these 4 chapters of theory, I wanted to ask if, among our seminar group here or out there in the broader webinar space, feel free to use the Q&A function to chat in questions or things you might have. If there's anything lingering that you're still thinking about from chapters 1 through 4, are there questions, comments, reflections that you're bringing in tonight? You're like, I really wish I had had the chance to ask about this, or I really wish I'd had the chance to hear from a few people about, this, or I just can't get over this, or whatever it is, So is there anything lingering from chapters 1 through 4, new insights, things you're still thinking about, things you want to discuss further that you'd like to put to the group and to our discussion before we make this turn toward application with chapter 5? So thought I'd just ask that first. Maybe nobody has anything. Maybe we have a lot of things, but we'll take a few minutes and see if there's anything there to discuss it, if there is.
I could start by saying the thing that I said earlier, which is until the documents and the people that write them, including the Pope, whoever he or she is, until they're more sophisticated about scripture, the approach tends to be to sort of match a quote to a situation. And I think that's not going to get anybody anywhere, either with the problem that is being worked on or with understanding what scripture is. So the documents, the tradition of these documents has such a long heritage of proof texting that I feel thwarted by the fact that that's sort of what they do. And I think it's a total dead end. So I already said that, and there's nothing to be done about it, but except maybe to say there are so many things that could be done with scripture that are not proof texting, that it's a shame that we're not doing it.
Yeah, I think that's so important, Barbara. And, you know, I appreciate that you bring that back in, because for folks that maybe have read church documents, read encyclicals, read various things, the practice that Barbara is describing, this practice, I like how you said it, of matching a verse of scripture or a little passage of scripture to a particular idea, gets called in scholarly circles proof texting, and it's not viewed positively, right? Just to be very clear on that. And the reason for that is because it's an uncritical appropriation of scripture, meaning that there are people like Barbara Green, who's with us here, who have, you know, doctoral degrees in this stuff, who have dedicated their whole careers to understanding in the original language, cultural context, and, you know, on all these different deeper levels, the meaning of scripture. And in my experience as a theologian, who I'm not a professional biblical scholar, but I deal in biblical theology quite a bit, I am so informed and enriched by the people who do this work of biblical scholarship in a formal sense. It's really too bad, as Barbara is saying, that papal documents don't draw on these devoted people who are, you know, people of faith, you know, often religious people who are ordained, but also lay theologians who are experts on scripture in ways that can deeply enrich and inform preaching and teaching and our approaches to these questions. But often what we get whenever we read Catholic social teaching is a very limited use and appropriation of scripture that just sort of says, that's nice. That sounds like it kind of fits here. So, you know, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. I'll drop that in here because, you know, that reminds us of this sort of nice lesson. But there's so much more depth and richness that can be brought in there. And I think that what you just said, Barbara, is so important for us to keep in mind. And you said, you know, maybe there's nothing to be done about it, but hey, we're talking about it here. So maybe this will, in an inverse to Reaganomics, trickle up to Pope Francis or trickle up to the Vatican.
It's fair enough to say that before modernity, it was a great way to interpret scripture. And I'm not critical of them doing it then, but especially as we do things that are more sophisticated in science, the crunch is not going to work out well when the hermeneutes are still sort of doing a very pre-modern kind of thing.
That's right. And I like that you mentioned that in terms of dialogue with science too, because it's just not going to fly in dialogue with science. So we need that more rigorous and critical engagement for sure. That's great. Let's go over to Judy next.
My wondering is a little more basic. My concern is, you know, this problem, this issue is so massive. And of course, the document talks about a lot of global, multinational, you know, what large groups can do, and all the things that have been done that there's no follow-up, no accountability, no monitoring, and so on, and so they fail. But as an individual, it seems like anything we do is just such a drop in the bucket. And, you know, and people say that. And so we talk about, you know, carrying the water bottle or using a cloth napkin. And is that really going to, you know, reverse the effects of global warming? Well, certainly not on an individual basis, but it can be very frustrating or feeling like there's no, you know, okay, I don't have to do this because it's not going to make a difference. And I guess my question would be, how do we like rally the troops on the ground, the individuals, because we're not in, well, I'm not in a place or corporation or someplace that's making the big decisions. But certainly in a religious congregation, you know, there are things that we can do, but how to enthuse the people that haven't been at this seminar. I mean, I've been telling people, go on Spirit Alive and watch the replay, because I think this webinar has been great, and for me, I end each week feeling more like, oh yeah, I got to do something. But how do we get the troops on the ground to really feel passionate about this issue when it seems in many ways so impenetrable, so far removed from what we can absolutely do?
I appreciate that, Judy. Yeah, it's easy, and I encounter this with my undergraduates too when I teach courses on this stuff. You know, it's easy to slip into kind of a defeatism or something like that says, are we just, you know, destined for failure here? Is there no way to, you know, get about it? I think that is a really hard question, and it's actually also a good setup for what we're going to be doing these last 3 weeks, tonight and in the next 2 sessions, because we really do want to focus on that practical dimension, you know, on organizing, on getting people together and things like that. And, you know, as much as this might sound a little trite or something like that, I always want to come back to this idea, you know, that we can build small communities. We can build small communities, even if it's a religious community, but there are neighborhoods. And these, in some ways, this is like a getting back to the 1940s and 1950s, sort of like small community, 1960s kind of framing, but in and for a new world. And so it's not the same thing. It's not the same thing as the neighborhoods that many of us grew up with, because the world is different, you know? And so I think that being able to sort of integrate that is really important. Now, as far as, you know, activating the troops, I always will come back, and I don't want to kind of like say too much about this because we will talk a lot about it in the next few weeks. But, you know, this in a church context, this has to be in our preaching. It has to be in our liturgy. It has to be in our classrooms. It's got to be in our religious communities. It's got to come home with people. And I think that, to me, is one of the biggest gaps that we've already talked about in the past weeks, is that often this never gets talked about. You know, and you know, I had students actually just yesterday in class. We were doing Genesis 1 in my Bible and ecology course, and you know, one of the students said, "I grew up Catholic, and I never heard anything like this interpretation of Genesis 1 my entire life. The whole thing was the earth was made by God, and you're special because you're made in the image of God as a human, and there's nothing about responsibility or goodness or interconnectedness or ethic. You know, it's just not there." So we have to get it there. We have to do the work to get it there. And so I always kind of am a firm believer that settings like this, you know, the people who are we're all going home somewhere, and we're all going to churches, or we're all going to different communities, and we can be the sort of, you know, proclaimers of that word as well. And Barbara, to that point in the chat, mentions the Laudato Si action platform. I'm going to say more about that next week as a lead in to week 7. So we'll save that thought, but we will do some stuff with that. But Judy, I think you're naming a real perennial issue here whenever we talk about this stuff, and we're going to do a lot to try to get people to care. So I'm going to go to the Q&A, and then Tom, I know you just put your hand up, but I was going to move us ahead because I don't want us to lose too much time to talk about chapter 5 as well. But Tom did mention in the chat that, you know, the reminding us, as we've talked about indigenous communities, you know, asking permission from plants and animals to use them. What a different way, you know, wow, indeed, as Tom said, like, what a different way of thinking about, you know, our relationship to the world around us. It's really powerful stuff. And maybe there's a Christian equivalent of that. Maybe this is, you know, the table prayer that many families say, you know, thanking God for what we have, but being really intentional about actually naming the resources that we're using, the things that we're consuming, and giving thanks for those as gifts. I think there's more than bless us, O Lord, that we can do with our table prayers that actually really puts us into touch with the actual resources, the actual creatures, right, that we are consuming, because consumption is inevitable. We got to eat, but if anything else, it's going to foster more mindful eating. It's going to foster greater consciousness of how we're consuming if we elaborated on what's on our plate and gave thanks for it in a genuine and authentic way before we consumed it. So maybe that's one thing that, Judy, to your point, we can take home with. Everything teaches, every little thing teaches us something. So the more we can be intentional and mindful about how we approach the things we do every day, I think the better off we're going to be. Those are the little things that can add up maybe as we organize into communities. So real quick from the Q&A, Deborah Steedle is asking, does any nation have more equitable and fair economies than ours that is, as we said, rooted in things like slavery and low wages? There are European countries for sure that are making efforts. A lot of places in Scandinavia in particular, you'll see living wages actually like written into law, that are quite different from here, where, like where I live in California, people will say, oh, $18 an hour, that's a lot. And then you say, look at the cost of living here, that's not even a living wage. But there are places in Europe in particular that are passing living wage laws. And so that might be a place, and it corresponds well with chapter 5 that we can look towards in order to get some ideas there. So Deborah, that's one thing that comes to my mind. Scandinavia in particular, I think, has been pretty progressive on this. Yes, and to Marita Grudson, yes, absolutely. Issues of rapidification and instant gratification are so big as obstacles to the common good. I think that, we live in a society, and we're going to see this tonight, where profit is understood to be the measure of everything. Profit is the measure of success. And until that changes, and we have a more holistic, creation-centered, people-centered, common good-centered, understanding of what really it means for us to progress, right? We're not going to get beyond that. And I think that, that's the constant tension that we live within. It's like we've got all these wonderful resources of our Christian tradition and all of these great big ideas that we're talking about. And at the same time, when people get up in the morning, they do have to ask the question, how am I going to have enough money to put food on the table for my family? Students wake up in the morning and they say, how am I going to, do well in my classes so that I can get the job that's going to allow me to live the kind of life I want? And those are real tensions, right? Sometimes we can wax idealistic and say, if only we could all just, basically be like a monastic community of the world. That's what Pope Francis is kind of suggesting, right? Now, maybe the people who are in religious life are like, think again, this is not good, but whatever it may be, I think that we have to really be honest and open and direct in addressing those real tensions that people face, because people do have to feed their families and they do want to live healthy, good lives. And at the same time, we want to live for this vision of a better world that Laudato Si is giving us. So it's not an either or, it's a both and. And because it's a both and, there's a really tough sort of to navigate tension that emerges in that as well. So I think it's great to acknowledge that and really to put that at the center of our thought, because there's a lot of care and compassion that emerges when you think about the real struggles people have. Nobody wants to be sort of a ecological dictator here. And I don't think Francis is trying to do that. So it's important to think about that. And finally, yes, we have a comment on leaf blowers. Leaf blowers are often upheld as like the icon of, environmental degradation. Leaf blowers. We actually have gas guzzling devices that blow nature off of our man-made, human-made pathways, right? We have literally paved paradise, and put up a parking lot, and then we built a device to blow the nature that gets on it, the dirt and the leaves, off of it by using fossil fuels, right? Think about that as a sort of an exemplification of the technocratic paradigm, that we have these polluting, gas guzzling, devices that get the leaves, get that nature off of my path. I'm trying to walk through my town, right? Think about that like as a sort of image or an icon of what we're talking about. It really is wild and compelling. And we have electric options that are there, and the point that our person in the chat is making is that people need to know, to Judy's point, what kind of changes they can make. So I'll say something about this later on. My question would be, why do we need leaf blowers at all, right? We could ask that question. But if we're not ready to go that far and ask the question, do we really need leaf blowers at all? We might instead ask the question, what options do we have for making leaf blowers work with nature and not against it? And how can we consume along those lines? So that's good. So excellent. This is great. I just wanted to touch base, check in on kind of where we've been, name some of the things, say a bit about them, and let that kind of get us into chapter 5. So that's where we'll kind of go and concentrate our energy from here on out. And we've already started to touch on some of these issues by talking about, economic dimensions and things like that. So let's turn to chapter 5. Insights now from the group or in the chat. The typical opening question: what struck you, stood out to you, stayed with you? What do you have questions about? What are you thinking about having looked at chapter 5 and as we enter into this conversation tonight? So take maybe 3 or so observations to get us started. Bonnie, go ahead, and then Maurice.
179.
179.
179 was very powerful to me. It's talking about the existing world order proves powerless to assume its responsibilities. Local individuals and groups can make a real difference. And then further down, it says that society, through non-governmental organizations and intermediate groups, must put pressure on governments to develop more rigorous regulations, procedures, and controls. So it's putting the onus on individuals, empowering us to drive government and policymakers.
Yes, that is right. I mean, we are seeing a call to community organizing here from the Pope in an encyclical, and saying this is something communities need to be doing. Just keep in mind, what are communities but little collections of individuals? That's what they are. They're little groups of individuals. It's so funny you went there, Bonnie, because in bold in my notes for my talk tonight, I have in paragraph 179, one of my favorite paragraphs in the entire encyclical. I have that right here. So I'll be saying that later on, and you already got us there. So that's great. Thank you. Maurice, please.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. If I learned one thing from Miriam McGillis, is that we all live out of our perceptions. And related words to perceptions are mindset, paradigm. The Pope says the word conviction right off the bat in 164. There's growing conviction, our perception, our mindset that our planet is a homeland and that humanity is one people living in a common home, an interdependent world. I would say an interdependent mindset. I mean, that's not a word we use very much. Interdependent in terms of economics, in terms of world relations. So if we could all come from that particular mindset and live out of that reality that we are all one, it would go a long ways towards righting the ship.
Totally agree. And I think that, that he says interdependence over and over and over again throughout the encyclical, but especially in this chapter. And I think because, right, he's talking about economic, social, and political systems, which at least in, the European West and in North America are, as we talked about in a couple of weeks ago, driven by this sort of idea of the radical individual. And he really wants to challenge that and to overcome that and to make us, I love how you frame that, because we've talked a lot about perception, something that we see, and we see the world through the glasses, right, of interdependence, not through the world, not just sort of say, oh yeah, I understand that everything is interconnected, but we actually see it and experience it as interconnected, so that when we go to, buy stuff at the store or whatever it is, we are seeing the act of purchasing and consuming and, making political decisions or whatever it is on the basis of radical interdependence, not on the basis of radical individualism or personal preference. That all gets kind of subjugated to the concerns of the common good. So I think that that's really excellent way of talking about that point, Maurice.
Thanks. He calls for that radical change several times in this chapter. Once again, yep.
Yeah, and you can imagine probably folks out there, right? You saw as you were reading, you can understand why a lot of people were really uncomfortable with where some of his discourse on capitalism and consumption goes here. So it's great. So we'll do Tom and Virginia, and then we'll move ahead. Tom, go ahead.
I very much like the paragraphs 183 through 185, just because of my professional background in NEPA. The environmental process, I think, is so important that we do what's called alternatives analysis to arrive at, and this is really forced in the United States, it's called the LEDPA, the least environmental damaging practical alternative. So you compare the alternatives and you choose the one that is the LEDPA of the federal government, the state government, and the local governments all involved. It's transparency, it's honesty, and it's also a buy-in. And with the alternatives that you choose, then you develop what's called a PAMP, a preferred alternative mitigation plan of how you're going to make up for the losses. And in any environmental process, we look at the direct, the indirect, and the cumulative impacts along with the cost-benefit ratios. So there's a considerable amount of things that we do as part of the environmental process. And when we first started, Paul had mentioned that it can cause some, difficulties for some groups. And within a company, the environmental process really sometimes is hard to accept when you're an engineer that you want to go from A to B with a straight line and not to avoid, to minimize or mitigate impacts. So really the environmental process extends the process because you need to learn what are the alternatives, which is the one that you're going to choose and why, and it has impacts on how you're going to make up for those impacts. And I really like that because in my whole life, when I was growing up, I saw so much damage to the environment. But when I got into NEPA, I'm not saying it's perfect, but it forces everyone to work together and for the common good. Why do you want that alternative? I mean, what's the purpose and need for even your project? What's the alternatives you looked at? Which one did you choose? What is the environment that's affected? And what are the environmental consequences along with mitigation? And it's an extended type of process. But when you're done, you have reasons for why you did what you did. And the mitigation goes on for 5 to 10, sometimes 20 years to make sure that you're committed to what you said you were going to do. So
good. Yeah.
183 to 185 was very special to me because it's a part of my life of where I feel I put back.
And I think you're right that, Tom, that's so good, to think with that. And it's great to have the practitioner's angle in the room, somebody who's actually lived in this world and had to live within the tensions and the challenges of navigating these decisions in business and in engineering. And I think what you highlighted, really well that I would lift up is, that this is something that is often managed and mandated in, the context of the United States, for example. And Pope Francis is calling for a global sort of acceptance of a paradigm that says, let's think about impacts before we do anything at all, and so this, NEPA may be one example of a way in which we've tried to implement that and put it into use. And I really appreciate you bringing in the sort of practitioner's wisdom and knowledge, from your own experience to be able to illustrate that. And I can see very well how those paragraphs resonate with your experience. So thank you. Yeah, let's go over to Virginia.
Well, I like the simplicity and clarity of the end of paragraph 170, where the bishops of Bolivia had said that basically the countries that were responsible for the damage, have a greater responsibility for providing a solution to the problems they have caused. Mm-hmm. That seems fair and right to me, and so I would like to see more of that in action. But of course, those are the countries that are making a lot of profit, so they don't want to.
Like right here in the good old US of A, right? We're one of those countries, to keep that in mind. No, Virginia, that's excellent. It's funny, you again, just like in our first comment from Bonnie, I was going to read that quotation out from the bishops of Bolivia, who are saying basically what we need here is not a one-size-fits-all solution. And this is one of the things that Pope Francis really emphasizes. And he draws on two key principles in particular from Catholic social teaching. One is participation, which is about everybody's consultation and voice. And the other one is the principle of subsidiarity, that the decision should be made at the localist, for lack of a better word, the most local possible level. And so the bishops of Bolivia are calling for that and saying, hey, look, we are suffering the consequences of a problem that is not really of our own making. And so if we're going to have not just an equal, but what we would call an equitable response, right? That means that there are going to be differential responsibilities. Not everybody's equally responsible, because responsibility is based on how much a particular country or corporation or institution has contributed to the problem, not just like, oh, everybody needs to do this together. Now, this quickly becomes a sticking point in international discussions, because places like the US or China or India or Great Britain or other places will say, no, I don't really know if I'm comfortable with that, right? Because they know that if that kind of line of approach were followed, that the cost that would be put to the US or to, a country like China or the UK or something would be exponentially higher than the cost to a place like Bolivia. And so this becomes a sticking point in international discussions, which is one of the many reasons I'll talk about here in a moment why Pope Francis is so right to highlight the fact that, these are great ideas and we need these international agreements, but all too often they break down and they're just not capable of doing what they're supposed to do for a variety of reasons. So Virginia, I think you're highlighting a really important problematic there as well. It's great. So excellent. All right. Well, I'm going to jump in with my comments, some of which intersect really closely with what's already been said. And so, invite you to listen and enter in on here, and we'll come back around on the other side of this with time for more Q&A and discussion. All right. So chapter 5, Lines of Approach and Action, opens up with what I think is a really kind of stick in the ribs kind of quote, right? Pope Francis says in paragraph 163 that he is seeking, quote, paths of dialogue which can help us escape from the spiral of self-destruction which currently engulfs us. I kind of was like, tell us how you really feel, Pope Francis, right? The spiral of self-destruction that currently engulfs us. But he's right. I mean, this is how serious these problems are. And so in parallel with his focus in chapter 4 on integral ecology, which if you remember, we said is an ecology that takes stock of everything under the curve, he says that we have to ensure that our solutions serve the needs of all people and of all creation. And in paragraph 164, quote, do not simply defend the interests of a few countries. And this is exactly where Virginia's point starts to enter in. And a concrete example of this that many of you may be aware of is that, there's been some recent research that has argued that 90 companies in Europe and North America predominantly are responsible for 70% of historical greenhouse gas emissions. So if you trace the whole history of greenhouse gas emissions from industrialization back to the beginning in the 1800s, 90 companies, almost all of them in Europe and North America, are responsible for 70% of the total greenhouse gas emissions since industrialization occurred. 90 companies. So that tells us these are really old companies, and they are in very privileged countries. And so this is why, in Francis's eyes, and as Virginia was just saying, we can't make the poor pay the price of ecological well-being. If we put that burden and try to spread it out equally, poorer nations are just going to end up getting poorer, and their environments are actually going to be further degraded because they're bearing a burden that they can't afford for a problem that they did not create. So it's not just unfair, it's unjust. It gets at a deeper level of a systemic injustice against poor countries. And this is why the bishops of Bolivia say, you know, the countries that have benefited from this high degree of industrialization have a greater responsibility for providing a solution to the problems that they have caused. And I'm going to give a couple other examples from Central America that I think illustrate just how pressing this is as we go along. So Pope Francis then says what we need to recognize, kind of to Maurice's point, that we are one world, and if we live in one world, we need a common plan. And this means we need deep level solutions, not quick fixes. So the plan must include measures to reduce pollution and, you know, increase sustainable agriculture, as well as providing, Pope Francis says, things like universal access to drinking water. You know, one of the things that I think those of us who are privileged enough probably to participate in a seminar like this, in a program like this, may not recognize is that there is a huge portion of the world's population that does not have regular access to clean drinkable water. We've talked about this a little bit before, but Francis really drives that point home because that is the fundamental, the basic biological need, the basic biological human right is for water. And, you know, as I was preparing for this kind of in the wake of Holy Week and everything, I want to sit with this for a minute because I could not help but think of Jesus's words at the end of the Passion, according to John, right? John has, you know, Jesus says, I thirst. You know, and then I started thinking about the tradition of liberation theology and the idea of the crucified people. And if Jesus, right, is in the moment of his crucifixion says, I thirst, he is expressing this physical lack and this physical need. How much more are the crucified peoples of our world today who lack access to clean drinkable water, thirsting, right, in this deep and radical way for something that is the basic need, the very basic need in order for them to be able to not live a good life, not live a productive and happy life or whatever, you know, kind of adjectives we would put there, but just to live at all, right? Just to exist at all. And so that connection of Jesus's I thirst on the cross with the reality of what liberation theologians call the crucifixion of the poor today, it just really hit me as I was thinking about this in light of sort of Good Friday. And I think there's a real challenge there that says, you know, how can people who live in more privileged places be so easily comfortable? And I'm guilty of this too. Like, I don't think about this on the day-to-day, you know, be so easily comfortable with the fact that there are people around the world who don't have access to clean drinkable water. Like, that shouldn't be a thing. That shouldn't be possible. And it's very tough for me to like sit with that. So I just wanted to share this more of a personal kind of thought, but it came to mind as I was reflecting on that in light of that John Passion that we heard proclaimed on Good Friday. All right. So that's the baseline. We need a structural framework that acknowledges we're one world and really responds on the basis of that. Now, from here, beginning in the next section, kind of around paragraph 164, 165, up to the 170s, Pope Francis acknowledges many good efforts, like the Earth Summit from Rio, the Stockholm Declaration, 1972, Rio +20, you know, we might add here the Paris Agreement, which is more recent. And here is where I was going to cite also recent efforts in places like Costa Rica and Ecuador that have given legal standing to rivers and swaths of land. And if you're not familiar with this, do a quick Google search on this later on. There are increasingly Central American countries that are granting legal standing to water and legal standing to rocks and legal standing to land in order to ensure that it cannot be destroyed. So it's not just the human right to water. Now there is the question of what rights the water has to flow. And this is kind of an emerging conversation that I think is really fascinating, because these rights that these countries are talking about are based not on our ability to possess them, but on their ecological function, one, meaning what they provide for ecosystems, habitats. Yes, they provide drinking water for us. And also often because of their spiritual significance to indigenous communities who have lived near these waters and who view these waters as sacred and blessed. And so I imagine, sure, we have national monuments, national parks, wildlife preserves here in the US, but what if we actually started to, grant legal rights to the Mississippi River, or grant legal rights to the Colorado River that says this river has a right to flow on the basis of the inestimable value of the contributions that it makes to the ecosystem broadly, which includes us, right? We are within our ecosystems, not outside of them. Can't say that enough. So in the midst of these movements, these agreements and things like this, Pope Francis also acknowledges that there has been, and this is his quote, a lack of political will, that's what he calls it, that he says stymies these efforts. And I think this gap, personally, in kind of my own analysis, arises for maybe 4 reasons that I'd name. The first one, which I think is the most significant, is that these international agreements are non-binding. They are nice, they give us a good vision, but in most cases, they are not legally binding. They do not have any consequences. They are not enforced or even enforceable. So all these countries sign the Paris Agreement and they say, we're going to commit to this. But there's no what happens if they don't do what they said they were going to do. There's nothing there. There's no penalty, right? And we know that if that is the case, right, people are going to find ways around this commitment that they've made, and they say, oh, it's just unrealistic. Like, we're going to be economically disadvantaged if we cut production by that much by 2030. Give us till 2050. Right. And that's what keeps happening. That keeps happening. So first reason, they're non-binding. There are no consequences. The second one is, political motivation, and in particular, the influence of lobbies in places like the US. The lobbying industry is this multi-billion-dollar industry where, oil companies, fossil fuel companies more broadly, and all kinds of different forces are asking the government, investing billions of dollars. Now, I can't even imagine what $1 billion is like, but, investing billions of dollars to push through certain pieces of legislation and to obstruct others so that their interests are protected. And that ties to, I think, the third factor, which is the economic costs of things like infrastructure change and workforce development, right? Frank last week talked about the realities in coal country, right? Think about the intense work it would take to convert our whole energy system from fossil fuels to solar, right? The cost that would take, the amount of training and education it would require for people who were coal miners, say, to become solar engineers, right? It's a totally different way of doing things. And so there's a real challenge there, and that often rubs up against political will, where there just aren't subsidies for this kind of stuff. There aren't subsidies for rethinking or transforming our energy system because it's just too costly. But here I would simply quote Pope Francis, and 172, he says, quote, "The cost of this would be low compared to the risks posed by climate change." And I'm just like, yes, that is the obvious recognition that if we have a long enough term vision, the costs of these kinds of like piecemeal transformations are actually quite low compared to, say, the extinction of the human species, which we clearly don't want. So how are we going to make those changes, right? That's the kind of thing. And I think all of this kind of culminates in what I would say is the fourth point, which is kind of the point about our perception, to Maurice's point, and the point about sort of, what can we do, to Judy's question earlier on. We humans tend to have a hard time thinking that anything is worthy of protection if we can't see its direct benefit to us. And I think, unfortunately, that often when I think back to that idea of clean drinkable water, for example, this applies to the human poor as much as it applies to our ecosystems. You know, people who are, you know, the human poor around our world, poor people around the world, in a capitalist understanding, are not worth much. Now, that runs directly counter to the idea of human dignity, to the idea of the dignity of the person, you know, this God-given idea of dignity that Pope Francis talks about, Catholic social teaching talks about. But again, I would ask, you know, how is it so easy to live with the reality of global poverty? Like, we all know that the poor exist. We all know that there are people out there who can't access water, who can't get food, who don't have their basic needs met. How is it so easy for us to go about our everyday lives? And, you know, people out there who are, you know, in our group here who are in business or whatever it is, it's just like, it's not, I'm certainly guilty of this too, but like, how is it so easy to do that? There's a moral conundrum there that I really have been thinking about since Good Friday in particular, that I just want to keep kind of reiterating, articulating to the room, because I think that is underneath the surface of this analysis that Pope Francis is offering. How is it that we're so comfortable, so indifferent, even when we know that people are living in such extreme poverty? It's just a hard thing to, what is it, the tough something to swallow, tough pill to swallow, right? That's kind of how I see that there. And so, you know, he considers these different, you know, approaches, different ways that we might go about this. But what he consistently calls for, and I think this is kind of the point I was just trying to make in paragraph 172, is the need for an integrated vision. Keep in mind the integral ecology idea, right? That allows us to both end poverty and end ecological degradation while also allowing for socioeconomic development. So if you think back to those categories of economic, integral economics, right? An economic ecology, an ecological ecology, and a social ecology, what we need is a solution that can do all three things: end poverty, end ecological degradation, and allow for socioeconomic development. Because he doesn't want this thing we're calling progress or growth to end, but what he does want is to challenge, and he says this, I love, he uses this word, quote, the scandalous consumption, that's the phrase he uses, practices that we see in many privileged parts of the world, in many privileged countries, scandalous consumption practices, right? Think about that in light of the reality of global poverty. So he then says, paragraph 175, quote, the same mindset which stands in the way of making radical decisions to reverse the trend of global warming also stands in the way of achieving the goal of eliminating poverty. And I think that's so good and so compelling. The same mindset, that same perceptual orientation, like Maurice was talking about, is standing in the way of both our ability to end the ecological crisis and to eliminate poverty. So again, we have to see them as sides of a coin, right? And there's a great quote from Benedict XVI that kind of lays it all out, that the global economy, reviving economies, the deterioration of the earth, you know, food security, protection of the environment, all of this together needs to be integrated not only into an ideal of ecology, but also into our political systems. So this is where Pope Francis starts to make the turn toward politics and to say, okay, these are all also political issues. They're not just a vision of the way that, you know, the world can be. They are also realities that politicians are debating and discussing and passing laws about that regulate how income is distributed, how resources are distributed, who's taxed how much and why, right? These are political issues. And because they're political issues, they are issues for the people. They are issues for community organizing. They are issues for people to be, you know, be active and speaking out about. And so beginning in about 175 and carrying on, you know, I have to admit, like when I got here, I was like, he does not express a lot of confidence in laws and regulations, you know, and rightly so, I think, because often the people making those laws and regulations are the people who are benefiting from them. They already have the degree of power and privilege that they sort of reinforce through the way that they construct laws. I mean, think about, you know, movements to like tax the wealthiest people in the United States versus the number, okay, of tax write-offs a wealthy person can get for charitable contributions. So if you're a billionaire it's easy to live without paying taxes because you just have to give a relatively low number of, a small amount of your money away every year, and then you don't have to pay taxes on your $1 billion anymore, right? That against these movements that we, hear calls for to tax the wealthy and things like that are together kind of, wrapped up in the US context in the possibility, with the possibility or the impossibility of social transformation, and keep in mind here too, like my ethicist friends like to say, most of the laws that exist in our world exist because we were doing something wrong, right? Like we make laws to prevent bad things from happening. And that isn't going to be enough. Pope Francis says, frameworks that try to, quote, avoid bad practice will never be enough. We need comprehensive systemic solutions that are rooted in deep political transformation as well. And he says too often in paragraph 178 that, quote, the myopia of power politics, I love that phrase, serves short-term economic gains, electoral interests, and party considerations and those kinds of things, right? People are really concerned about what the Republican or Democratic Party platform is gonna do or allow for. They're not really concerned so much about what the social and environmental impacts of these decisions are gonna be. And he says that's where we need to be focusing, right? So that brings us up to, again, in bold, one of my favorite paragraphs here, Bonnie, that you cited, this sort of spirit of localization, right? The spirit of building small intentional communities that intend to provide for the needs of others and to protect others. And here, looking ahead to what we'll do in weeks 6 and 7, I might just encourage us all to think about, where we can find or make communities. We already live in communities, right? But where can we build community? How can we do this? Is it among your families and friends, parishes, schools? Are there ways that we might bind together to share food or energy or resources? Or to minimize waste? Community compost is a great way to do this. Have one compost bin and everybody brings their food waste and throws it into one bin, and it becomes rich soil that you can use to garden and to grow more food, right, in a particular place. Have a parish compost bin, like a big composter. Everybody brings their stuff to church on the weekend and dumps all their food waste, right? Like, there are ways we can do this. Thank you, Maurice, for the thumbs up, right? There are ways that we can do this that are centered in the communities that we already belong to, but it's so counter to what Pope Francis calls the throwaway culture, wherein, right, we can just toss it in the trash and the garbage man takes it away. And that's a whole industry. But we don't have to participate in that industry, right? That's the kind of thing that I think he's calling us for, is to imagine different ways of being community and of building community that disrupt power politics and that challenge these sort of dominating interests that we face. And oftentimes, like the compost idea, I honestly think it's often a lot easier than we might think it is to get these kinds of things off the ground, because people really do care. And whenever they do classes like this or they read Laudato Si, they'll come to care. And once that happens, people will participate, So it's just like an imagination thing. What can we do? And this is where, in 181 in particular, he calls for activism and organizing. Maybe that's something that doesn't, I think in the US context, doesn't often seem like it aligns with, our sort of Catholic Christian faith. Like, people think of activists as sort of, secular folks who are doing this kind of stuff. But, I invite you, if you're familiar with people like the Berrigan brothers, right? And, the Catholic worker movement, Dorothy Day, these great figures, who are icons, really true icons of organizing and activism in our Catholic tradition, not outside of it, but from within the Catholic tradition, who, fought for nuclear disarmament, who fought against the Vietnam War, who protested against these things, and who today still are being arrested for participating in like Black Lives Matter movement or working against the Dakota Access Pipeline, during when all that was going on up in North Dakota. One of my good friends was, arrested for going up there and standing on the front lines. He's a Catholic worker. it's just really important to recognize that when Pope Francis calls for things like organizing, that we can acknowledge that this is good, one, because I think often in the US organizing gets a bad rap, and also that it is something that has always been part of our tradition. If you think back to Rerum Novarum, right, understood to be the first document in the Catholic social teaching tradition on labor, right? Rerum Novarum was written out of the concerns of workers, right? Out of the concerns of workers who were unionizing and who were seeking representation because their rights were being denied by industrialization. So we have this long and often, I think, unsung history that Pope Francis is calling us to really activate. And as we were saying, you know, we can push politicians, we can push corporations to look beyond the short-term vision and to recognize that even though that is the status quo, and even though, and I think it's important to be real about this, the status quo works really hard to keep itself in effect. Like, you know, the status quo doesn't want to change. That's why it's the status quo, right? But we have to keep working to disrupt it and to challenge it. It's sort of a contemporary turning over the tables, if you will, you know, in the Gospels account of Jesus. Like sometimes tables need to be turned over. And I think there is kind of a call to action that is in some of this, you know, political action campaigns, whatever they might be, that we can do to organize people and to get our politicians and get our community leaders on board with the kind of structural change we need, you know. And so this brings us, I think, to the point Tom was making, and Tom made so well, about things like environmental impact assessments and business planning. Now we're moving from politics to economics and to corporate life, right? One of the things Pope Francis says here is that environmental impact assessment needs to be not at the end of business planning, which is often where it usually is, right? But at the very beginning of it. And what I find so interesting about this, right, is that the fact that it's typically absent, you know, highlights this really important gap in our imagination, because it's sort of like, you know, all that our business practices are for, all that our economic practices are for, is to get the job done, which means to grow, foster growth and profit and all of these kinds of things. But Pope Francis basically says, I mean, he does say this explicitly, we cannot let the culture of consumerism guide everything. Not everything is about profit. We might need to slow down, which, if you know, right, in a capitalist economic system, slow down is heresy. It is the first heresy of, you know, capitalist society, because we have to constantly be in this process of rapidification and growth in order to sort of establish, you know, where we need to be. And so, you know, one thing I might suggest in this regard, and this is actually an insight that I gained from reading about and teaching Taoism and ecology in one of my classes where I do some interreligious engagement, is that, you know, Taoism is all about sort of yes and no, the black and the white, the yin and the yang, right? That's the symbol, the yin yang symbol is the symbol of Taoism. The growth progress model, you know, that we're talking about will always say, if the question is, do we need this bridge, right? The sort of growth progress model that Pope Francis is critiquing will always answer that question with a yes. And then it might implement practices in order to sort of, like Tom was saying, mitigate or control the sort of negative impacts of it. But I think the more radical sort of idea here that Pope Francis is putting forward with this idea of slowing down is that sometimes the answer to the question, do we need X or must we do Y? Sometimes the answer to that question is no. Sometimes we need to say, we don't need that bridge because that bridge is going to cause more cars to drive and pollute these waters or whatever it is. Maybe the answer is no. And one way to frame that the processes that Tom was talking about really do well is to ask this question, not just how is this going to get more people from point A to point B, but what's the impact of this going to be in 10 or 20 or 25 or 50 years, right? And if we haven't asked those long-term vision questions, that's Pope Francis' concern, we are going to collapse back into that culture of consumerism and rapidification, where everything is about short-term gains and short-term profits, and like, how in my 70, 80, or 90 years on this earth do I get as much money in my bank account as I possibly can? I mean, that is the kind of the spirit that we're challenging here. And that spirit is very attractive, that spirit is very attractive. And so thinking in these ways is really challenging and really radical. And you can begin to probably imagine why a lot of, economists and business leaders and politicians, Catholic politicians, business leaders and economists were like, yeah, Pope Francis, stay in your lane. I don't think you should be talking about these things, right? Because there's a really radically disruptive call to action that he's issuing here that I think gets under the skin of certain things. So that's that. So all of this is to say, and I hope that, back to Judy's question earlier and comment earlier, I think all of this is to say, as Pope Francis says in paragraph 180, truly much can be done. He has that with an exclamation point. I love that little sentence that he puts in there. Truly, much can be done. We can be organizing. We can be building intentional communities. We can be generating these programs. We can be choosing not to participate in certain systems. Sometimes the best thing we can do is to decide not to do something, right? Never forget the words of the Confiteor, right? What I have done and what I have failed to do. Well, it's also, maybe the opposite of what I have done is the remedy to what I have done is choosing not to do it, right? And so entering in those words, I just think that's a nice little liturgical way of thinking about that. So in the home stretch of this chapter, that's where we are now, beginning in paragraph 189, we see another strong call for this synergistic approach to politics and economics that is, again, oriented toward the common good, by which I mean oriented toward both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, right? And I think paragraph 189 is so telling on how Pope Francis's vision is operating, because there he notes that the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, he says, it offered us this great opportunity to develop a new economy. It was a critical juncture. We reached this sort of like caesura in our economics where everything stopped. And we had an opportunity to say, okay, maybe this system isn't working anymore. Let's do it a different way. Let's rebuild the system. Let's reconfigure the system. And then he says, of course, but we didn't do that, right? We haven't at all transitioned toward a real economy. We had the opportunity to do it because one of the reasons why that financial crisis happened was because we were not accounting for the real economic costs of our models of production and consumption and rapidification and growth. So we had a chance, and he kind of says we blew it, and then again begins to critique profit-driven economics, saying that when people do not acknowledge that, right, and they say, oh, you're standing in the way of progress, right? I often say this to my undergraduate students. I'm like, business major who is, really passionate about environmental justice. I'll say, well, what happens when you go to your boss and you say, you know what, I think we need to cut production by 25% in this quarter, right? What happens? You get fired, right? On the spot, or they laugh at you and they send you away because you're standing in the way of progress. You're standing in the way of growth. But it doesn't have to be that way. Truly, much can be done, to come back to that line. And so what I think is great is that in 191, Pope Francis says that idea of progress, that idea that says grow, 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 go, 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 is not really what progress is. That's not actually what progress is, at least not in a Christian understanding. He says, we need to grow in the conviction that a decrease in the pace of production and consumption can at times give rise to another form of progress and development, by which he means the integral form of progress and development, where everything begins to grow together because we're allowing our ecosystems to recover. We're allowing the poor, access to things, but our systems, our profit-driven systems, cannot see this. And so in the sort of the final analysis, bringing all this together, we might say that true progress happens when we see ecological and social systems and the creatures that inhabit them flourishing together in relationship with God and with each other, right? That is the real measure of what it means for things to grow, to flourish in relationship. Because while that isn't how our world is currently structured, that is the vision, because if the world were structured that way, we wouldn't see the disparities we see. We wouldn't see the degradation we see if this idea of a collective flourishing in relationship were the center point of this. And that's really what the principle of the common good is all about. So that's kind of the reorientation. And I cannot say enough how radical I actually think this reorientation is. It's a real challenge. And so in broad strokes, how do we do this? Well, I want to start thinking more and more together about how do we do this? Well, we need broad dialogue, listening, and participation on a global scale. That's one of the things Francis says. We have to let subsidiarity guide us. He names that explicitly in paragraph 196, this major principle of Catholic social teaching. We need a willing and widespread redistribution of wealth and power according to need, which is just as we talked about with Ananias and Sapphira, right? That funny story in Acts is exactly what we see called for in early Christian communities. It's also, to be clear, the number one thing that is what made people very uncomfortable with this chapter. We had a lot of Catholic politicians, as I said, saying like, Pope Francis, stay in your lane. The Pope should focus on salvation. That's what they said. Pope should focus on religious matters. And they're missing the whole point, right? In my analysis, at least, that these are matters of salvation. These are matters of well-being. These are matters of faith. Everything is a matter of faith if you really listen to the gospel. So that's what I would say. These are religious matters, profoundly so. And as Christians, we have that call to build a better world that reflects God's intentions for creation, flourishing, goodness, well-being, and leads all creatures to be able to flourish together, and in keeping with the title of the encyclical, to praise God, right, as one community, to say, Laudato Si, together, praise be to you, right, my Lord. And I think that that is the deeper sort of richness of this chapter and what it offers us in thinking about politics and economics and all of those things. So that's where I think this chapter takes us. And I would love to hear Thomas saying, yes, we have, or Frank, organizations like Pax Christi that are doing kind of work that leadership is so important, as we see. Pope Francis is a leader here, putting this forward. So I'd open it up to the room for comments, questions, conversation, whatever it might be. And we'll turn it over to our group to discuss whatever insights might emerge from our exploration of this chapter. Yeah, Maria, please.
I spent a lot of my life living in Italy, and I was thinking about sitting down. If I were listening to this with some Italian people I know, I don't think they would have as a harder time with this as Americans do. I mean, this, when I read what the Pope was describing today, and you said, he doesn't have a whole lot of faith in people, and he actually asks that rhetorical question, is it reasonable to even think that people are going to, I forget where it was later on in the chapter. No, not in America, it's not reasonable. But there are other countries where capitalism is inflected with a little bit of socialism. And, in this country, you can't say that because, like you're a communist pinko or whatever, but where there are laws that already exist to promote, to not just stop people from doing things, but to actually promote the common good and a better distribution of resources. I mean, I don't want to bore anybody, but I had so many experiences of that living in Rome. And I remember saying to my landlord at one point, why don't you come to America? Because you could work like 7 days a week and make all the money you want. What are you, crazy? And I remember him saying, now, why would I want to do that? And I learned, but I think if you go out to other cultures and other nations, you see an entirely different reading of this text that's not as hostile as what you get in America. So I just wanted to say that. I think if we listened with different ears and eyes and grew up in different cultures, some of this would be balm for our ears and not like nails against a blackboard.
I totally agree, Maria. And I think that we have also from Michelle Boche in the Q&A saying, you know, Michelle is married to a Canadian, and he has a totally different view too. You know, there's this countrywide, you know, culture of care for each other. You know, and I think here's a funny example, maybe. I don't know if there are fans of the Great British Baking Show out there. I love that show, right? I love to bake and cook. It's a big part of sort of who I am. But if you've ever watched the, you know, Great British Baking Show and then compare it to American reality television, or like Top Chef, or, you know, the shows on the Food Network, it's so different. They're all so nice to each other, right? And it's like, yeah, we're all in competition, but somebody will be like, oh, do you need help with that? You know, that kind of thing. So this sort of like, it is a very cultural thing. And for me, Maria, like I mentioned before, I think my mom, you know, comes from a Lebanese background, and you know, we were very sort of, and both on my mom and dad's side, very community oriented, and so much of what I experienced as a kid was like a sort of tension between coming from this very community, family-centered kind of thing, and then seeing my friends and other people that lived according to this more sort of mainline American WASP, you know, Protestant, you know, work ethic, you know, that whole thing. And it never made sense to me. And it was when I saw the film, My Big Fat Greek Wedding, that I was like, oh, that's my family. Like, that is what I grew up with. And it's so different in terms of how it allows you to see and to experience community and to think about things like food and care and all this kind of stuff. And of course it has its downsides too, right? But I think you're so right to cite these cultural differences, because that is such a factor. And in some ways, I think, you know, the fact that so many American ears were bristled, you know, Americans bristled at what they read in Laudato Si, says something about the fact that, like, we may be the ultimate bad guy here in terms of sort of this world order that Pope Francis is really critiquing. So I think there's a real challenge there as well. That's great. I'm going to copy paste into the chat for everyone. I hope this is okay with you, Suzanne. A great comment from Suzanne Barbaresi, who chatted in and made some connections with past weeks. But the thing I would highlight here is just the things that Suzanne is pointing out, which has to do with the absurd, as she says, amount of meat consumption, and also the absurd amount of water that it takes to fuel the industry of meat, you know, the meat industry, basically. I mean, you gotta give cows tons of water. So whenever we look at water use, one of the biggest reasons why we consume so much water in the US is because we eat so much meat. And so cutting back on meat does not just have an impact on one's, you know, sort of fossil fuel impact because of methane and things like that, but it also has a huge impact on groundwater quality, groundwater availability, and that kind of stuff. So this is a superly insightful comment. Thank you, Suzanne, for that. Other comments from the room? Yeah, Judy, please. Oh, let me unmute you here.
I just wanted to mention this one thing about water. Where I live in El Salvador, the average temperature is about 95, between 92 and 104. So you need a lot of water. We have to buy it. And people buy, you know, if you're out walking or at work or whatever, and you run out of the water that you might have brought with you, if you even did that. But these little blue bags of water, of plastic bags, are everywhere. People buy them. You bite off the top of the bag and you suck the water. And then when you're finished drinking your water, you throw the bag on the street. So the streets are lined with all these little blue plastic bags that had been filled with water at one time. And, you know, when we talk about the integration of the climate, global warming, and the and poverty and marginalization, there needs to be a whole campaign, say in the country, around what to do with your garbage, with plastic, and there's nothing of that, and it's just all over, and it's like the mayor put out a few garbage cans but never had a campaign about telling people to use it. So you see the streets literally littered with blue plastic bags that present a whole other dilemma. And I'm reminded of that quote as I was reading this chapter on, I think it was Andre Lord, who said, we don't live single issue lives. And so all of this is just so very connected. We need the water, we drink it, but not everybody has access to it in the same way. And some people are forced to buy blue bags for 15 cents a bag.
That's right. And often behind that, at least when I was in El Salvador last in 2019, there was a lot of discussion around the Coca-Cola Corporation and the bottling of Dasani. And I know that that's ongoing because Coca-Cola has invested huge resources in dominating the water market in El Salvador, which increasingly leads to actually lack of access disguised as greater access, because then the market is being controlled, and folks who are already marginalized and suffering political and economic, exclusion and oppression, it becomes even harder to get water. And as Judy is saying in the illustration of the plastic bags, often at greater environmental cost, because there isn't infrastructure for recycling and reusing in those contexts in the same way. So we're just adding to the marginalization and the oppression and the poverty that is already there. So this along, Tom is suggesting chasing coral and plastic ocean, if you want to kind of look at the situation of plastic and in the ocean as well. We're out of time, so I want to bring us to a close here. Diane, I'm sorry. Do you want to, in 1 minute, say what you'd like to say?
No, I was just going to say, some of our sisters and students from Malloy College and others periodically go to El Salvador, and one of the projects that they're involved in is trying to get access to clean water into a couple of communities. And I think we can just imagine the uphill struggle to do that, but they've accomplished to some degree.
That's great. Yeah, and there are students at the UCA as well, the University of Central America, engineering students and people who are trying to build sustainable infrastructure for water in El Salvador as well. But it is an uphill battle, often because, as our last comment here from the Q&A, we see consistently this sort of lack of a long-term vision all the way back to the 1960s and 70s, when oil was kind of beginning to be used more and more. That vested interests tend to prevail, as Maria Novotny is saying here, and it's difficult to see how this dynamic will change. But I just want to say one more time to bring us to a close, truly much can be done. And so as we continue into these last couple of weeks, I invite you to think about what can be done. How can we organize? How can we communicate? How can we follow this radical call of Pope Francis and really try to make it a reality? Well, next week, as we look at the last chapter of Laudato Si', we're going to be looking at spirituality and education and how all of this intersects on that level. And then we'll really let the rubber hit the road in week 7 and talk about the action plan and ways that we can turn this vision into practice as we go forward. Maria.
Well, can I just make one announcement? Yeah, this is a little commercial announcement. So Barbara Green and I are biblicist and friends. So since I saw her in the group, I said to her, hey, Barbara, I know you're not happy with how scripture is read in these texts. I said, so why don't you do a course for me for Spirit Alive? So Barbara is actually going to do a course. This is a preview of coming attractions sometime in the coming year, because we had a discussion. It connects with what you said today, Paul. A kid will come into your classroom and say, hey, all I ever learned about Genesis is like, I'm the most important person in the world, made in the image of God, and that's it. And Barbara and I have had some sidebars, and we've discussed the fact that leads people sometimes to put the Bible aside and start reading other traditions that they think are more inclined to support the kind of thinking that we're engaged in this particular course. So Barbara wants to take you through, I think her course is going to be reading scripture for all it's worth, 4 classes that are going to teach us how to mine scripture for all it's worth, that will be resources in our tradition. And I think I've kind of convinced Paul that he's going to do another course for us too on the Bible and ecology. So the good thing about Spirit Alive is that it's alive, and good things happen as we talk to each other. And from these good things, we grow and we flourish and we nourish ourselves with more and more wonderful people like Paul. So that's my little commercial for tonight.
And you. Thank you, Maria. And
Thanks,
thank you
Paul.
all for
Great,
being
thank
here.
you.
You're welcome.
And we'll see you next time. Have a great
Thank you. Good night.
Good
Bye-bye.
night.
Good night, thank
everybody.
you.